space of what we can learn from the natural world, given that everything in the natural world has evolved over millennia to be the best it can possibly be. And I think there are an infinite number of ways we can learn from what's out there, and that's one of the reasons why it's so important that we protect the biodiversity that exists in the world today.
Interesting documentary on Māori television earlier this week called Seeds, where just the devastation of the number of varieties of all plants that we've just got rid of. Sometimes 95% of different seeds have just disappeared. It's crazy. It really did worry me. Now, Phil, prototypes are being developed for these bags and shoes. The price is high at the moment. What's your price point to get a pair of shoes that are made from mushrooms?
Well, this is a great topic, because actually people generally aren't prepared to pay anything extra for animal welfare or environmental benefits. So I think the products will be a long time coming into production, to be honest.
I don't think I'll be champignonning at the bit to get any of the mushroom clothes, that's for sure. All right, it's 3.5 away from 5. We've got time for one more story. When was the last time you digitally disconnected? As Angela Lashbrook writes on the Medium website, everything is online now, and we need to find ways to politely disconnect. She makes the case for bringing back away messages. Some listeners may remember those messages that would pop up, signal that a user was unavailable to chat. What do you make of this, Joe? Do you think you're able to disconnect quite easily?
I don't find it particularly easy, but I'm making a valiant effort to disconnect a lot more, because I think you could just spend hours. I'm almost embarrassed to say that when that notification on your iPhone started coming once a week to say the average amount of time you'd spent looking at your phone screen, and you think that's a working day that you're spending over the course of a couple of weeks. Wouldn't you be better spending that time doing something else? So I'm totally pro-away messages. I've set alerts on social media. I've got rid of most social media apps from my phone. I don't want to spend my life just scrolling mindlessly.
Phil, have you found that working from home during COVID has made it more challenging to disconnect?
Yeah, I think I have. In some ways, during lockdown, it was better, because you could actually just control. You could just switch off. This comes 6:30 at night. Just put down your device and switch it off, because you'd be looking at your device all day. Whereas now it just seems to be a little harder to control. I tried a little thing today. Actually, I put my watch back on, so I wasn't having to look at my phone to tell the time, which has helped.
Joe, what sort of things do you do to try and just extricate yourself from that?
Well, they're all, none of them are particularly rock and roll. I like to get out in my garden, like to get a bit of sun on my skin, maybe go for a walk, maybe talk on the phone rather than stare at the screen. Nothing particularly groundbreaking, but, I think they're far more likely to contribute to my overall happiness and contentment of my life.
And Phil, what about yourself? What do you do to just switch off from the electronic life?
Maybe a bit of sport there, Mike. Ride my bike. Go for a run, go for a walk in the bush.
Oh, sounds fantastic. Well, that's the last story we have time for today on the panel on RNZ National. I hope you've enjoyed our show today. We've had some great feedback from you, and we really appreciate that on 2101. Cardi B wants Trump out too. Lady Lowell, give yourself an uppercut with that $100. It's time for Checkpoint after the news at the top of the hour.
Te whakarongo mai koe ki te reo irirangi o Aotearoa. This is Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm Lisa Owen. E haere aki nei, fake news and conspiracy theories could jeopardise a shift to COVID Alert Level 1. When coronavirus closed our border, tourism took one for the team of 5 million. So if we're closed to international visitors, what's the industry's future? Calvin Davis and Todd McClay join us live. An investigation's underway into allegations of corruption involving guards and gang members at Rimitaka Prison. The terminally ill Australian father who's been told to pick just one of his 4 young children to visit him in his final days due to COVID restrictions. And New Zealand schools open their classrooms to foreign children stuck here because of the pandemic.
RNZ News at 5. Kia ora ko Susana Leata tēnei. Far-right groups and fringe political leaders are being blamed for peddling COVID-19 misinformation. It comes after it was revealed people linked to the Mount Roskill church cluster were sceptical about the seriousness of the pandemic. The Health Minister Chris Hipkins says misinformation could impede the country's path to Alert Level 1. He is not ruling out a more punitive approach if people continue to deliberately spread lies.
The reality, though, is just look at what's happening internationally. You can see that this is very, very real. The virus is very, very deadly. There is no vaccine for it, so people can't protect themselves from it. The best protection that we all have is through our collective efforts to give the virus nowhere to go.
Chris Hipkins says leaders of the Mount Roskill Evangelical Church are now working with health officials to make sure members of its congregation get retested for COVID-19. The New Zealand First Leader Winston Peters says he will keep shaking hands on the campaign trail in breach of social distancing rules. The Auckland region remains at level 2.5, while the rest of the country is at level 2, meaning social distancing rules apply. Mr Peters has been campaigning in the South Island this week and says he has no problem breaching the rules because the South should be at alert level 1.
The reality is the lockdown should never have happened outside of the Auckland super city region. And that's probably demonstrably obvious now. It could be said that the government or members of the government should explain why this has happened to the South Island.
Winston Peters will be campaigning in the North Island next week. The Mayor of the Queenstown Lakes District wants changes to physical distancing rules on commercial flights for the school holiday season, with the tourist area in a dire straits economically. Currently, commercial planes are only able to fly with half to two-thirds capacity. Jim Bold says that's having a detrimental effect on the number of visitors to the district, and he says, given the requirement to wear masks on planes, the distancing requirements are excessive. The Green Party is playing hardball on tax, floating the prospect of sitting on the crossbenches if Labour does not take a more extreme position. Labour has promised no tax changes other than a new income tax bracket covering only the wealthiest 2% of New Zealanders. But the Greens also want a wealth tax hitting those with a net worth over $1 million. The Greens co-leader James Shaw was asked whether he was prepared to walk away from the negotiating table if Labour refused to budge.
It's always a possibility. Ultimately, the Green Party membership get to decide on the nature of the agreement. They get to approve that once we've finished negotiations.
James Shaw says voters need to support Greens if they want a truly transformational government. The police investigation into corruption at Rimutaka Prison relates to offending said to have begun some years ago. The National Organised Crime Group has been investigating staff at the prison for 8 weeks. The investigation's head, Detective Inspector Stuart Mills, says an earlier police operation prompted them to start looking into what he calls matters at the prison.
We've been undertaking the investigation since July this year. We've interviewed a large number of people as a result of information from a earlier operation, but that investigation has now led to court matters, so I'm unable to comment any further.
Stuart Mills says because it's still an active investigation, he cannot be more specific on what's happening. A former Waikato University employee says racism there is prevalent and she supports former colleagues for speaking out. The university has commissioned an independent review into claims by 6 Māori staff members of casual and structural racism. When at the university in 2018, Leonie Pihama joined a protest with staff and students to fight a proposal to remove the faculty status of Māori and Indigenous studies. She says staff have been marginalised ever since.
And Māori staff and Māori knowledge in that faculty have been incredibly marginalised in the university, been made invisible in many ways. They no longer have a board of studies, which is integral to be able to operate as a faculty.
Education researcher Leonie Pihama. The future of this year's Rugby Championship is set to be decided tonight when the New Zealand Rugby and its SANZAR partners have a conference call. COVID-19 has kept administrators on the back foot trying to nail down plans for the annual tournament involving the All Blacks, Springboks, Wallabies and Argentina. Here's rugby reporter Joe Porter.
In July, SANZAAR said it wanted to host the championship in a hub scenario in the November-December test window with New Zealand its preferred location. However, hopes for that appear to be fading, with the Sydney Morning Herald reporting the tournament is now likely to be held in Australia if it does go ahead, due to their more flexible quarantine rules and ability to house teams in isolation facilities that also allow them to train together. The Pumas and world champion Springboks haven't had any rugby since March, while 6 Argentinian players have also tested positive for COVID-19. Should the championship not go ahead, the expectation is that New Zealand and Australia will play 2 Bledisloe Cup tests in Sydney next month. Ko Joe Porteraho.
The All Whites will play England for the first time in almost 30 years at Wembley in November. A month before that, the All Whites will take on the world's top-ranked side, Belgium, in Brussels. That's the news.
When a president's public and private statements collide.
It's going to disappear. One day it's like a miracle. It will disappear.
It goes through air, Bob. That's always tougher than the touch. This is deadly stuff.
And the 15 within a couple of days is going to be down to close to zero.
It's also more deadly than your strenuous flus.
When it gets a little warmer, it miraculously goes away.
I wanted to always play it down. I still like playing it down.
Yes, sir.
Because I don't want to create a panic.
And I think it's going to all work out fine.
The big stories as they break. Morning reports weekdays from 6 on air and online.
Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. Northland to Waitomo, also Coromandel, Bay of Plenty and Taupo. Cloudy tonight, isolated showers turning to rain for a time. Tomorrow, showers in Northland and becoming fine elsewhere, apart from a few showers in the afternoon or evening. Gisborne and Hawke's Bay, fine, then showers from tonight, some heavy tomorrow with hail. Taumaranui and Taihape to Wellington, also Wairarapa and Marlborough. Occasional showers turning to rain for a time tonight, some showers heavy tomorrow with hail possible and snow to 600 metres. Nelson and Buller, rain easing to a few showers, fine tomorrow. Westland and Fiordland, fine apart from occasional showers about southern Fiordland. For Canterbury, occasional showers with snow lowering to 600 metres for a time, easing tomorrow. Otago and Southland, showers clearing tomorrow and becoming fine. Chatham Islands, occasional rain. RNZ National, it's 7 minutes past 5.
Thanks, Susanna, and welcome to Checkpoint. I'm Lisa Owen. Tonight, the door's shut to international visitors, so how does the tourism industry wade through the turmoil COVID has brought? We'll have Labour and National's tourism spokespeople with us. But first, fake news, misinformation and conspiracy theories are putting the country's COVID-19 response at risk and could block the path to Alert Level 1. That was the strong message from the Health Minister today after he announced more cases linked to the Mount Roskill Church cluster. Now a sociologist is raising the alarm about far-right groups and fringe political leaders. Katie Todd filed this report.
What continues to be troubling and is threatening to block our path to level 1 is repeated, deliberate and malicious spreading of misinformation. We're continuing to see organised campaigns that are designed to confuse and to sow doubt about our response.
Health Minister Chris Hipkins fronting this afternoon's COVID-19 briefing with a plea to think twice before sharing information that can't be verified. He says the spread of misinformation has to stop, but he's looking for cooperation rather than taking punitive steps.
The reality, though, is just look at what's happening internationally. You can see that this is very, very real. The virus is very, very deadly. There is no vaccine for it, so people can't protect themselves from it. The best protection that we all have is through our collective efforts to give the virus nowhere to go.
The battle is supposed to be against the spread of COVID-19, but some church groups are facing a battle to stop the spread of false information in their communities. They're not alone. Sociologist Paul Spoonley has his eye on tertiary institutions and groups with far-right views setting up on campuses.
Who are really talking to those who are suggestible, who are keen to hear about alternative views, and they are certainly spreading misinformation about various aspects of the pandemic and who's behind it.
The other source of misinformation that worries Professor Spoonley is fringe political leaders. That includes Advance New Zealand co-leader Billy Te Kahika, who has been telling his followers the government planned the most recent Auckland lockdown in advance. His party has used quotes from epidemiologist Dr. Simon Thornley, who doesn't believe lockdowns are the right response to the pandemic. They've posted his comments on Advance New Zealand's Facebook page. But Dr. Thornley says he isn't politically aligned and he doesn't believe conspiracy theories. However, he does believe people can oppose the lockdown and the government's response without being conspiracists.
I'm guided by the science. The politics of it is not something for me to comment on, but I do strongly believe that government policy should be guided by the science. We're learning a lot in a short space of time with this virus.
National President of the New Zealand Union of Students Associations, Isabella Lena-Hanaiken, is confident students have the skills to know verified, trustworthy information when they see it. And she says universities are putting out regular, updated, verified public health information students do trust.
But I think that more work can be done to inform, not only students but the wider public on how to counter that misinformation, because we definitely haven't seen that kind of escalation or challenging process being advertised, I don't think.
Health Minister Chris Hipkins says everyone has the right to be sceptical and hold their own views, but equally, everyone has a right to be safe. For Checkpoint, ko Katie Todd, TNA.
The Greens are playing hardball on tax, floating the prospect of sitting on the crossbenches if Labor doesn't take a more extreme position. Labor has promised no tax changes other than a new income tax bracket covering the wealthiest 2% of New Zealanders. But the Greens want to go further. The topic was still on people's minds as party leaders spread out around the country, making their case to lead the next government. But as our Deputy Political Editor Craig McCulloch reports, not everyone is following the rules.
Oh, nice to meet you. Thank you for looking after us. We love you.
It's campaigning COVID style, but as week one nears its end, the novelty's wearing thin.
We'd love to have a hug, but I know. I can give you an elbow bump. Okay, yeah.
Punters struggling with the social distancing rules as Jacinda Ardern tours Taupo. The restrictions near ignored in a packed Palmerston North cafe with Judith Collins.
Well, they're telling us. So we've got to be, try and do the right thing. Anyway, nice.
And Winston Peters is not even trying, shaking hands with one South Islander after another.
The reality is the lockdown should never have happened outside of the Auckland super city region. And that's palpably, demonstrably obvious now.
The Greens, James Shaw, paid a visit to Wellington City Mission, the bottom 2%, a bid to demonstrate why Labour's tax plan, which hits just the top 2%, is too weak. The Greens want to go further. A wealth tax is one of its top priorities. So much so, it could walk away from the negotiating table if it does not get what it wants.
It's always a possibility. Ultimately, the Green Party membership get to decide on the nature of the agreement. They get to approve that once we've finished negotiations.
It's all a minor headache for Labour, which insists it won't introduce any further taxes than already announced.
We've been very clear on our tax policy, and ultimately then it's up to voters to decide how they cast their vote in an MMP environment. Whichever way they move, then that's what we deal with in the aftermath.
There is the small matter of an election, and so I would say let's see how people actually vote.
The situation only playing into Judith Collins' hands.
The Labor Party is just using it as a stalking horse, and we're very aware that they actually have another plan.
But National's own money plans came under question today too. Its planned infrastructure bank would borrow up large to finance an infrastructure boom. But Labour says it's just a trick to try hide National's true level of debt.
They do seem to be engaging a form of tricky accounting.
That's just more misinformation. I mean, for goodness sake.
Judith Collins says it's simply good business practice.
We will be obviously counting that money, but it's not strictly on all the Crown books, but it is on government agency books, and no one's going to be doing anything like that.
The policy agenda was light today, just Labour bringing forward its target of 100% renewable energy to 2030. A light agenda, leaving plenty of time for talk about topics the parties would rather avoid. From Palmerston North for Checkpoint, Craig McCulloch.
The family of a terminally ill Brisbane man is fighting for permission to bring his 4 children over the state border to see him one last time, after initially being told only one of his kids would be allowed into Queensland. 39-year-old Mark Keynes has inoperable cancer and is not expected to live until Christmas. His 4 children live in Sydney and his extended family are in Port Macquarie, so all of them are in New South Wales. But the border between the neighbouring states is locked down due to COVID. It comes as Hollywood star Tom Hanks was granted an exemption this week to self-isolate at a private hotel. AFL players, along with their families, have also been granted exemptions to self-isolate together at a private hotel in preparation for next month's grand final. Mark's sister, Tamara Langbourne, says a month after applying for an exemption, they've had no decision from the Queensland government, just the initial suggestion from officials to choose one of the 4 children to visit their dying father.
We were told we were being selfish because we were putting other cancer patients at risk. So my brother isn't in a cancer ward at the moment. He's actually at home with care at home. So we're really unsure about that.
But you were told at one point that only one of his 4 children would be able to visit him.
Yeah, so they'd pick one child up at the border and drive them to my brother, and they'd be given an hour and then return back to the border.
What did you think of that?
It's horrendous. Like, as an adult, we can choose who can go, but how do you choose that of a child? Like, they're going to grow up thinking, the 3 that didn't get chosen, like, why didn't I get to say goodbye? Like, there'd be resentment when they get older. The questions that one child would have it's emotional, and they wouldn't have their support system there. It's too much for kids to go by themselves.
So how is he doing at the moment?
He's having rough days. He's trying to be tough. He's trying to act like he's doing better than he is because we are so far away and he doesn't want to worry us. But because the cancer's in his bones, especially his spine and his diaphragm have become really brittle and are starting to chip away. So he's not doing the best, but he's trying to fight because he does want to see his kids, and that's his last wish before he passes away.
So there are, quite a few family members, aren't there, in and around Sydney. What do you want to do, given that he is in Queensland? What is your wish? How would you do it?
Well, we'd all like to go and say goodbye, so we've offered to quarantine together before we go and get COVID tested until we get our results back. We cannot fly it due to my mother, but we are looking at hiring a van and all travelling up together, so there's no risk of too many people and too many vehicles going all up at once. We've offered to quarantine, we've offered to do everything, but there's still lots of questions that we don't understand.
Even if you go into quarantine, has the Queensland government given you permission to visit your brother with the whole family and all his children? If you quarantine for 4 weeks, will they let you do, for 2 weeks, will they let you do that?
So we haven't been accepted for anything yet. They're still questioning, and they've only just opened up my application today.
So how long ago did you make that application?
About a month.
I'm imagining this is a time-important situation. Do you have time? It really
is. We don't. So originally we thought we had a bit of time until they actually did a lot more scans and worked out that it was a lot more severe than what they originally thought. So now with how things are failing and where all the cancer is, he doesn't have as much as he was originally told.
Do you have the time, does Mark have the time for you all to be in quarantine?
We can't honestly answer that. We want to say yes, but with how his body's reacting, we can't be sure he does.
When was the last time he got to see his kids?
Just over a year ago. So it's been quite a while.
So tell us a little bit about them. There's 4 of them.
Yeah, so we have Noah, who's the oldest. and he's quite a smart boy. He's funny. We have Katie and Caleb, who are the twins in the middle, and it's actually their birthday today. They've just turned 11 today. They were both preemie babies, really early preemie, so they've been through quite a lot in their life already. And we have Isaac, who's 7, and he loves dancing and singing and being cheeky.
And I'm not making light of this when I say this, Tamara, but if I presented you with this scenario, okay, you've just told us about those 4 children, choose one to see their father. What kind of burden would that place on you?
I couldn't do it. Like, who could you send? Would you send the oldest one because they're the most maturest? Or do you send the younger ones because they need that bit more time with their father? But they don't quite understand cancer. They know that he's about to die, but they don't understand why or how that's happening. And you couldn't send one without the other.
Tamara, is your family being treated, consistently? Is Queensland being consistent in this? What about sports people and Hollywood stars and the likes? Are you all getting treated the same?
Oh, that's a definite no. I did receive 2 phone calls prior from Queensland Health telling me that basically my application's useless, that it's most likely going to get rejected anyway, and that I really need to think about it before I keep going with it. So for 2 phone calls for that, and then to see all these people getting in there with massive amount of families and whoever they want just because they have a name or they have money, it really hurts. And that's not just for me, that's seeing all these other families as well that are going through this.
So you're referring there, to some of the Hollywood actors who have managed seemingly to get over the border?
Yes, as well as the AFL people. For the grand final, they can all go up with all their families and sit by the pool and have a jolly good time. Where if we get given the chance, we're going to say goodbye to someone. It's not going to be a great time.
What kind of support are you getting from local politicians or within your community? Is anyone lobbying on your behalf?
Our locals have been absolutely amazing. The second we emailed them, we had phone calls. We've had emails. They've keeping in contact. They've been fighting for us since the second we got in contact with them. So our local parliament and our local people have just backed us 100%.
What would you say to Anastasia Palaszczuk if you had the chance?
Give Australians a break. We understand that coronavirus is such a big thing. I mean, I understand border restrictions, but this is something that we'll never get back. You can do a grand final again, you can do whatever you want with those things, but you can never see that person for the last time. And especially for their kids, they won't get that chance, and that's with them for the rest of their life.
That was Tamara Langbourne talking there. It is 23 minutes past 5 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. We'd love your feedback. Let us know how you feel about the fact that fake news and conspiracy theories may jeopardise a shift to level 1. What should authorities do? And the campaign machinations. Winston Peters is shaking hands all over the place down south despite social distancing rules. What do you make of that? And the Green Party's playing hardball over tax policy. So you can text us on 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ or flick us an email, checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Police are investigating possible corruption at Rimutaka prison involving guards and gang members, which might have been going on for years. An investigation has been running since July and involves a large number of corrections staff. RNZ's corrections reporter Charlotte Cook filed this story.
The National Organised Crime Unit has been investigating staff at Rimutaka Prison for the past 8 weeks. The investigations manager, Detective Inspector Stuart Mills, says an earlier police operation prompted them to start looking into what he called matters at the prison.
We've been undertaking the investigation since July this year. We've interviewed a large number of people as a result of information from an earlier operation, but that investigation has now led to court matters, so I'm unable to comment any further.
Stuart Mills says because it's still an active investigation, he cannot give more specifics about the situation. RNZ understands the investigation relates to gang members, money laundering and inmates allegedly paying corrections staff. Corrections Association President Alan Whitley says more than 70 officers have been interviewed.
We've been aware that the police have been doing an investigation there for quite some time, but we don't know all the details of it. It's been running for probably 6 to 8 weeks now. Look, all we've heard that the investigation is into some possible corruption. We know there have been a number of people interviewed. They won't all be suspects in this. They could be witnesses.
Alan Whitley says if there's been any kind of criminal activity, they'll expect to see charges soon. Corrections Minister Calvin Davis says the inquiries relate to alleged offending that began some years ago. A report from 2017 found correction staff at Rimutaka were overly familiar with inmates and didn't impose proper discipline, giving examples such as prisoners being allowed to wander into each other's cells. The PSA union represents about 4,000 corrections officers. The national organiser, Willie Cochrane, says he's never seen an investigation of this size in his career.
This appears to be run at a very high level. It's extremely unusual, to be fair. New Zealand boasts a very professional, robust corrections regime, and this type of incident is very, very rare. I've not come across something quite like this in nearly the 30 years that I've been involved in the Department of Corrections.
Willie Cochrane says to his knowledge there have been no corrections staff suspended. In a statement, the Department of Corrections says it welcomes the inquiries being undertaken by police.
The overwhelming majority of our people act with integrity, honesty and professionalism, and those who don't place their colleagues' safety at risk, damage trust in their profession and undermine the integrity of the prison system. They inevitably get found out and held to account for their actions.
Police say the investigation is continuing and no charges have been laid at this stage. In Wellington for Checkpoint, Charlotte Cook.
OK, let's mix things up a little bit and go to business early. Nicholas Poynton is joining us now. Nicholas, so Sky TV has reported its full year result. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, it's another full year loss for Sky TV, but to put it in blunt terms, they've taken a hit this year, but it's nothing like the hammering they took last year. It posted a $157 million loss for the full year ended June, which really pales in comparison with the $608 million loss they took last year. The latest result does include a hefty $171 million write-down in the value of its business, but once again, it's not quite as bad as last year. If you strip out all those big one-off costs, Sky posted a $41 million profit. Its revenue did fall by about 6%. That's because they did suffer a decline in advertising revenue as a result of COVID-19. However, they do say the appetite for its streaming services was up by a third. Unfortunately, though, that increase in its streaming services isn't really enough to offset those losses they've seen in their satellite customers. On the surface, though, if you do take this result, considering all the things that's been going on, it's really in line with a lot of those other company results we've seen. We did know that a lot of companies would be reporting some pretty ugly losses for this most recent financial year. However, the thing that investors will want to be knowing, and a lot of analysts will be paying attention to, is the outlook. What is this company's plan for the future? And with Sky, they do have quite a positive one. They are predicting a return to profit next year. Their chief executive sort of outlined how they were going to do that. They say they're going to roll out a new broadband product so people can watch what they want, when they want, and how they want. They're going to improve the offering of its satellite operations. So that's for people who still have a set-top box. They may seem outdated for many people out there, but they are still really important for those people who live in regions where their Wi-Fi maybe is not really up to scratch to really service those streaming services. And has also acquired the digital streaming service Lightbox. You pair that in with what they already own in Neon, and they're going to really have quite a good chunk of the subscription video on demand market. So all in all, look, there is some real upside for this company, but it seems that investors aren't really impressed with the result. Its share price has taken quite a hit over the course of the day, even though the company's talked about having a bottom line profit of between $10 and $20 million for the current financial year. It is worth mentioning that its share price did gain about 20% in the previous 3 days, so maybe there has been a bit of speculation going on there. So to look, the Sky, their share price closed today at 10.2
closed down 10.8%, which is about a 3-cent drop on its stock price. So it's sitting at 14.8 cents a share. And now that we're talking about the markets, let's do a quick wrap of what's going on in the NZX. It really rallied today after those falls we saw early in the week as a result of the big tech sell-off in the States. It's up about by 0.6% or 73 points to 11,812. Our dollar is at 66.8 US cents, 91.8 Australian, and rounding us off at 51.2 British pence.
Thanks, Nicholas. That's Nicholas Poynton with our business news. And coming up on Checkpoint on RNZ National, we'll have Labour and National's tourism spokespeople in to tell us how they plan to resuscitate the sector. School's back for hundreds of foreign kids stuck in New Zealand, and veggie and fruit growers say visa extensions won't do much to stem the looming shortage of workers. And the All Whites get a big date with England at Wembley. We'd love your feedback on anything you've heard on the program this evening. You can text us 2101, you can tweet us Checkpoint RNZ, or Facebook us Checkpoint, or the email address is checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Let's head to the headlines now with Susanna.
Far-right groups and fringe political leaders are being blamed for spreading COVID-19 misinformation, which the government says could impede the country dropping to alert level 1. It's been revealed people linked to the Mount Roskill church cluster in Auckland were sceptical about the seriousness of the pandemic. The Health Minister Chris Hipkins is not ruling out a more punitive approach if people continue to deliberately spread lies. The Green Party is floating the prospect of sitting on the crossbenches if Labour does not take a more extreme position on taxes. The Labour Party has promised no tax changes other than a new income tax bracket covering the country's wealthiest 2%. But the Greens also want a wealth tax hitting those with a net worth more than $1 million. Meanwhile, Labour is promising to bring forward the goal of 100% renewable electricity to 2030 if elected. The leader, Jacinda Ardern, says a Labour government will also accelerate the electrification of the transport and industrial sectors, invest in emerging technologies, and potentially in dry year storage solutions for hydro lakes. Young people stuck in New Zealand due to the pandemic can temporarily attend schools as domestic students for the rest of the year. The government says the decision affects at least 1,300 children between 5 and 18 years old. It says most of those families can't afford to pay international student fees. Emergency services are remaining tight-lipped about what caused an explosion at a Kāinga Ora-owned Invercargill home yesterday. 2 people who were seriously injured remain in a stable condition in Southland Hospital. A 3rd person received minor injuries. Fire and Emergency has referred further comment to the police, who would not comment on the cause of the fire or the explosion, but says they are investigating. The police are keen to talk to people who may have witnessed a clash between 2 groups in Palmerston North on Sunday, during which a person was shot and injured. The confrontation was on Brentwood Avenue, Highbury, at about 4:30. The police believe some members of the public may have witnessed the clash. Those are the latest news headlines from RNZ National. Our next news and weather update is at 6.
Thanks, Susanna. Kia ora anō. This is Checkpoint and I'm Lisa Owen. Last year it was our #1 export, but COVID has brought tourism to its knees after our borders essentially slammed shut back in March. To put that in perspective, the number of visitors in and out of New Zealand in the second quarter of this year was down almost 98% compared to the same time last year. The sector directly employs about 230,000 people, but with no signs of the country opening up to international visitors anytime soon. What is the future for an industry that has until recently made up almost a quarter of our exports? Well, joining us now in the Auckland studio is Labour's tourism spokesperson, Kelvin Davis, and in our Wellington studio is Todd McClay, National's tourism spokesperson. Good evening to you both.
Good evening.
Todd, I'm going to
Lisa.
start with you first, Todd. I just want to get an idea of where you think things are at for the industry. Are we still in survival mode or are we in recovery mode, and why do you think that?
Well, look, I think it's a combination of both, Lisa. There are tourism businesses that are in survival mode and some of them who are not sure how they're going to survive. At the same time, there are real opportunities around domestic tourism. But the problem I think we have in the very short term is around confidence and certainty. So if we look at Taupo and Rotorua as an example, two tourist destinations, they started to do much better after the initial lockdown was lifted, and largely it was visitors from Auckland for weekends and for longer. But when we had the systematic failure at the border and this virus established itself in Auckland again, and Auckland went into level 3, the door was shut and those businesses
Todd,
actually had no security at all.
We'll get to confidence in a minute. So you think a bit of both, survival and recovery. Calvin, where do you think the industry is at right now?
Well, actually, I tend to agree with Todd. You know, there are some businesses that are doing it really tough, but also there are glimmers of hope on the horizon. We didn't expect domestic tourism to be quite as responsive as it was. So, you know, that was really positive. So, you know, we've put a lot of effort into supporting businesses. With our $400 million tourism recovery fund.
Okay, let's talk about that now. You're on the same page, it seems, in terms of where you think things are at right now. I think we'll see whether there's any divergence on how to deal with it from this point onwards. So, your $400 million tourism package, strategic assets funding. On the website, 26 businesses online have been given grants and loans. Is that all of them, or are there more to come? Have you spent it all?
No, there's more to come in.
Okay.
What we tried to do with the the tourism recovery fund is to try and spread it as wide as we could to make sure we got the biggest impact. So, you know, the initial part was $17 million went to the Tourism Transitions Fund to help businesses to either pivot to the domestic market or hibernate or to explore other options.
I want to talk specifically about the money that you've given to ring-fence what you call strategic tourism assets, right? There's some concern, we've spoken to industry players, that some of the big names who have got significant assets have been given, you know, large sums of money, and they believe the decision-making process is a little confused and inconsistent. Let's look at some examples. Wellington Zoo and Zorb Rotorua. What makes them strategic assets?
Well, there were criteria, and the criteria were that they had to either have an international or a national reputation, that they would attract visitors in their own right. If they didn't exist, then there may be significant loss of spillover effects into other businesses.
So how would losing Zorb significantly diminish the value of the region that it's in? It's in Rotorua.
Well, look, it met the criteria that were established. And look, the criteria and all the applications went through a very rigorous business. They were assessed, they were peer-reviewed, they were moderated by MB. And then there was MB consulted with a number of other agencies such as Māori Tourism.
So if Wellington Zoo is a strategic asset, then why isn't Auckland Zoo a strategic asset and every other zoo in the country?
Well, it comes down to them being assessed against the criteria. Okay. And like I was saying, they were
so you strictly applied that,
moderated.
Peer-reviewed. And they put in proper applications and all the rest of it.
They put in proper applications, and then, but there was another layer, or another 2 layers of scrutiny by other agencies such as Treasury.
I can hear Todd in the background, so let's give him a bit of a right of reply. Do you support that fund and the way it's been dished out? Would you have funded the same businesses that have been chosen, Todd?
Well, I don't know that we would have funded the same businesses, but we would have had a very open and transparent system that treated everybody equally and fairly. And your question, Lisa, about whether, you know, why Wellington Zoo got funding and Auckland Zoo didn't is a very good one. Maybe one of them had an extra elephant. Actually, both of them should have been assessed the same and had the same opportunity. The problem we've got is about $300 million was spent very, very quickly. Every single dollar of that has to be borrowed and paid back sometime in the future. And there's about 140 businesses around New Zealand that have been helped. Take the example of AJ Hackett. Look, good on him, he applied, but he was given $10 million to save 20 jobs. There'll be businesses down the road in Queenstown with the same, if not more, need and actually didn't get that funding and don't get to save those jobs. So
when
I can see why the tourism sector is so
Todd, you say you want
transparency.
What would that look like? So are you saying that National, if it gave out money to tourism assets, you would put all the papers out there into the public domain and we would be able to, as taxpayers, look at the criteria and all the documentation?
Well, look, I think in every situation where you're borrowing money for the taxpayer to pay back and you're giving it to support businesses, businesses, yes, you have an obligation to do so. There'll be the odd time where there may be some privacy around that, but actually this is money that future generations are going to have to pay back. And again, good on the 140 odd businesses that got access to the $300 million, but what about the tens of thousands of others that are not sure they're going to even get to open next week, let alone if there was another round?
Then that raises the question Todd is saying, what about the tens of thousands of other businesses? So I assume that he's saying that National would have funded those tens of thousands of other businesses, and then what's the cost to that? So, we had to make decisions, we had to draw lines in the sand somewhere, and that's exactly what we did. So the process was open, it is transparent, and of course there are going to be some people who didn't receive funding, so they will be upset.
Well, Lisa,
but we've always said from the outset that we couldn't save every business and every job, but we had to make decisions. Now, he said in his comments just then that this money was spent quickly. Well, he's spent the last 5 months criticising me, saying that we're not doing things fast enough. So, you can't have it both ways.
Oh, before we move on, I just want to ask you said everyone filled out proper applications. Whale Watch Kaikoura didn't, because we aid you, and they wrote a letter saying they wanted money. There's no application form, and there's not the full gamut of supporting paperwork that you would have had to submit with a full application. So what happened? Yeah. Why didn't they fill out an application?
But they did meet the criteria. They're a strategic asset to that region.
They had a different assessment, and you placed different requirements upon them because they didn't do what everybody else did.
So they are a strategic asset, and I think there's 180,000 visitors go there to Kaikoura every year. 100,000 visit Kaikoura Whale Watch, and
so
they were
why didn't they put in the same application as everyone else? Because you've just said transparency, everyone, strict criteria, auditing, everyone was required to throw their hat into the ring with an equal playing field. They didn't fill out a form.
Yep, so we made some decisions early because there were some businesses that were going to fall over. But the thing is that we then made sure that the applications came in, that we went through those applications. They went through 2 or 3 layers of scrutiny. The Tourism Recovery Ministers in the end made the final decisions, but we had to make decisions because Todd has spoken a lot about certainty. We had to give businesses certainty whether they were in or whether they weren't out.
But Lisa, I'm not sure that does give certainty. If anything, it detracts from confidence in the tourism sector. And so what the ministers just said is that one company has written a letter and they gave them money. There'll be others in Kaikoura that have just as much need, who may not survive, who weren't treated in the same way and weren't treated fairly. So when I say we need openness and transparency, we can't have a minister saying, well, on the one case, these people didn't fill out a form, but they had need, but others did and they missed out. That's where I think the tourism sector is so unhappy.
Let's look at your policy. This proposed Tourism Accelerator Fund, you'd be picking winners as well and would have to make decisions because you've got a cap on your fund, $100 million in the kitty, which is only a quarter of what the government has put into its kitty, and you can apply for 30% of the cost of a project that would increase tourism. You're picking winners as well. It's the same thing. It's just got a different name, isn't it?
No. Well, I can give you an absolute guarantee. If somebody wrote me a letter as tourism minister, I wouldn't just accept that. If there was a round that they had to go through to apply and fill out forms and be judged properly and fairly, they will have to do that. And so that's the first thing. The second thing is we will be announcing a full round of tourism policies in the coming week. So that's only one component.
So what have you got?
That's only one component of it. I'll just get through this. That's only one component of it. But ultimately, it's very similar to the Tourism Growth Partnership we had under the last government, where the tourism sector was able to look at innovation and ways to drive tourism, to change their businesses. It was fully assessed and decisions were made independently of the government. I would have a view that we would want an independent group of people making these decisions,
minister,
not the Cabinet. And
so
finally would have to come to Cabinet for sign-off, but I wouldn't want to be put in a situation that Calvin has just said he is, where he gets a letter and decides somebody gets money because he thinks they have
sign-off is the same scenario, isn't it? If you wanted total independence, you'd give it to a committee, you'd let them decide, and that would be the end of it. So you're just proposing a similar scenario to what we've already got, aren't you?
No, but by sign-off what I mean is that ultimately you come through the process, you have a funding round, and that comes before Cabinet. What I'm saying is we won't have a situation where a minister, a group of ministers decide that after getting a letter they should give some money to somebody. That's
Let's crack on because we've got a lot to get through. So just philosophically here, Calvin, How far should government go in supporting what are essentially private commercial enterprises, businesses? How far? Where's the line?
Look, we decided that we needed to support the backbone of the tourism industry so that the borders, when they do reopen and when domestic tourism starts up, that visitors have actually got something to actually visit and go to. That was the intention, and I believe that's what we've achieved. But if we talk about the National Party's policy, it actually is $100 million over 4 years, $25 million in the first year. Now, we allocated $400 million in the last 6 months. The $25 million that they're offering is 1/16 of what we've done. I really don't know. I think it's an insult, really, to the tourism industry to say, here's $25 million. I mean, the money we gave for dock concessions in itself was
a right of reply. Are you insulting the tourism industry? Todd?
Am I? No,
yes,
not
with
at
your
all.
policy.
No, not at all. I mean, that was the first part of policy, and I said we'll be announcing a full raft.
Okay, well, give us a taste of them. What have you got in the toolkit?
Well, there's a couple of things here, so I'm not going to announce it today, but actually what we're doing is looking both in the short term as how we get businesses through the next period of time.
Well, if you're not going to answer any specifics, we're going to crack on. So this sector, tourism sector, relies heavily on international tourists, like border restrictions since March 19. So what's your plan B, Todd? Lay it out for me.
Sorry, say that again, though.
What's your plan B? We've got border restrictions right now. We've had them since March 19. So we don't have people coming in, the floods of international tourists. What's your plan B for this
So there's two parts to this. There is the domestic tourism, and as I mentioned earlier, we've had the challenge of as we have had the systematic failure of the border and restrictions come in, then those domestic tourists don't get to travel as much as we need them to, which puts pressure on tourism businesses that are already covering debt. Firstly. Secondly, I do think we need a responsible and debate around what an open border might look like. If we have a consideration of Singapore as an example, they've indicated they've come to a position where they want to welcome New Zealand visitors there. I don't believe that the border of New Zealand can be opened safely today, but what is really important for the tourism sector is the start of that conversation about what it might look like and when it might happen, so they can plan and they can see how they can get through. The second part
so Todd, what level of risk in presenting that scenario where you're suggesting not throwing the gates totally open, but, opening the door a wedge, what level of risk is acceptable for you if you were the tourism minister, and what would that look like, a partially open border?
So a very low level of risk would be important. We do need to consider health. We need to make sure that the border agency that we...
So a low level of risk with health, would you rate that in terms of the spread number for the virus, the number of cases in the community, or what's your benchmark?
No. What I was about to say is we need to ensure that the border agency has control, one, of the border, and two, that we have track and trace and the ability to get on top of any incursion very, very quickly. That's the first thing. The second thing, and Lisa, I've been on the program with you earlier this year where there was ongoing discussion about the Trans-Tasman border, and the Cook Islands, the government had announced opening up travel to the Cook Islands. So that demonstrates there are opportunities or ways that this can happen. The problem we've now got is I think the public rightly has lost confidence in the government's ability to manage this, and it's pushed any discussion out a lot further.
Okay.
So I think there will be some opportunities where visitors can come to New Zealand safely, but we need to start that conversation today. So tourism businesses who are having to talk to their bank managers about how to get through the next few years have confidence that the government is taking this seriously.
I want to get to Calvin on this one because you raise an important issue. How can we open that border a little bit? And what work are you doing on that right now? What's your plan?
Look, so first of all, you asked Todd what his policies were, and he didn't. He just said he's going to want to have a big conversation. Our plan is actually being implemented. What he actually described is what we're actually doing in terms of the contact tracing. We had a resurgence plan. Unfortunately, we had to implement it, and that's what we've done.
But tourism industry wants to know when they can expect a change in the situation in the border and what that might look like and over what time period. So I'm asking you that. Have you got any papers being put together behind the scenes? What are your experts telling you about? Okay, Calvin, this is the option.
Yes.
What have you got?
So when COVID initially hit, people were asking me to stand up and speculate about when the Trans-Tasman bubble would be opened, and I didn't. I wouldn't speculate because businesses would go out and they would make business decisions about hiring staff and training staff and all those sorts of things. Now, thank goodness that we didn't speculate on timeframes because, to be honest, we were hoping it would be around about now that the Trans-Tasman bubble would have been opened, and if we'd got to the situation where we are now, now, after me talking about it, speculating about this time frame, businesses would have then said that we'd given mixed and confusing messages. So, if they want certainty, the last thing they need is someone standing here, a politician standing up and saying, look, I think it's going to be in 1 year.
I understand the quandary, and I think a whole lot of people do. I do understand the quandary, but how do you get around it then? Are you categorically saying that our strategy is elimination and therefore there's zero tolerance for cases in the community, and any type of border operation that risks that is a no-go zone? We're shut down until there's a vaccine.
No, I'm not saying that at all. There are things that can be done in the meantime. So, for example, Tourism New Zealand, they've been charged with keeping the brand New Zealand alive in the hearts and minds of our international markets. And if you ask, what are we going to do in the future, we know that we need to invest in our international markets when the borders do look like they're going to start to open. So, there's going to be we've already invested the $400 million on top of the broad support that the government's given in terms of the wage subsidy and things like that. But the next thing is to actually be enticing our international visitors over.
Yes, Todd, you go.
Lisa, I'm not sure that that's quite how the business community view it, nor how it works. They weren't looking for an absolute guarantee from Calvin that the border to Australia would open today. They were asking him for some information and advice, or at least a direction that the government was working on this. So yes, they could start planning.
No, I can tell you that he's wrong. They were asking me, when is the border going to open?
The problem that you have, Calvin, is the government has come out and it said that there is the government guaranteed loan scheme. Most tourism businesses can't get access to that at the moment because their banks won't lend them the 20% because they see them as being too risky. So if you had come out early in the year and said what you've just said now, you hope to have the border open by now under certain conditions, I think everybody would accept that it would not be responsible to open it with Australia today. What the tourism sector is asking is, number one, that there is work underway, and number two, when the government hopes this might happen, under what conditions, so they can plan. And if you don't do that, there are businesses that will close that probably don't have to.
Todd, the reality is when you're in opposition, it's easy to criticise and not have to come up with any kind of solution. So can you offer any more certainty? You can't really, can you?
Well, I think that we were starting to see certainty. We saw that there would be an opening up towards the Cook Islands. That was agreed between the two governments. That shows that it can happen. The discussion with Australia was quite advanced, and the Australian government announced that they were looking towards a trial.
But things change when cases come to light. When infections in states blow up there, you have to change your plan. So the reality is you can't offer guarantees either, can you?
No. So I'm not saying there's a guarantee, and I wasn't asking the Minister to give a guarantee. I was asking him to be open and talk about it more so businesses can start. But there are other things that can be done. For instance, I know that the New Zealand cruise ship industry has asked whether a cruise ship that's empty could come to New Zealand, a number of them, and New Zealanders could travel on those around the country that could be sold. They've asked the government, and so far there's been no engagement and no discussion. So what's really needed
let's ask Calvin about that. Would you support that? Cruise ships?
Well, first of all, what he's saying that there's been no discussion and no engagement is totally wrong. In fact, I've had personal conversations with people who have been looking at this. I've had personal conversations with people who are looking at other ways of supporting tourism and bringing tourists in. But we have to go through a process.
But is the work underway, or are you just having conversations?
The thing is that we can't actually go out and talk about this, because then we raise expectation and we give off.
So Todd asked the question there: is work underway, or are you just having conversations?
Well, look, I'm not going to go into the exact details of what we're doing,
but that's what the travel agents in the sector wants to know, whether the government is taking this seriously, surely.
Well, we are taking this very seriously, and we do have conversations at a number of levels with various people. But
Calvin, have you sought advice on whether or not there is risk and it will help the tourism sector?
I don't have to justify to Todd what we've done, because.
But he's not the only one listening to this conversation, Calvin. There's lots of people listening, and there are people in the industry. There are people who are going to cast their votes. Yeah. Let's get a couple of quick things out of the way. Todd, if you're all for certainty and tourism opportunities, will you be advocating hard with your leader for a Matariki holiday?
Yes, I will, and I do think Matariki is a good idea, and I support it. But I've got to tell you, when they announced it in Rotorua on Monday of this week and billed it as a solution to the challenges that the tourism industry is facing at the moment, it actually is not going to help at all. It's 2 years away. Calvin, if another holiday is going to fix tourism, let's have 10 this year, please. The tourism sector needs action now.
So you would support it and you're going to lobby Judith Collins for it. Or in terms of practical
I do think,
help...
though, Lisa, that we should take an existing holiday and move it over rather than another one.
Okay, well, that's a whole different story then. You've just taken away one long weekend for the tourism industry.
And that's the thing, the tourism industry actually welcomed that decision with open arms.
Okay, let's talk about...
give them time to
they might
adjust
do, although
to the fact
I'm jumping in here, Todd. I'm jumping in here because I want to know about practical help. So tourism industry Aotearoa, Calvin, it wants to ditch the social distancing requirement on planes, this keeping the middle seat free, because they say they can't get capacity on plane and school holidays are coming up and it's really making life difficult for them. Are you going to push for that to change?
Look, we have conversations in Cabinet. We've had this very conversation.
Are you pushing
though?
Are you advocating for it, or you just listen and they decide and you vote with them?
Well, I'm not going to say the position that everybody takes in Cabinet, but we have had this discussion. We understand the concerns, but ultimately, we take our advice from, we listen to the latest advice, the latest health advice, and we take advice and make decisions based around that.
Let me put it a different way. I know there are constraints about what you can tell us about what goes on in Cabinet. Do you see your role as an advocate for this industry? And generally, do you advocate hard with your colleagues for things that would help this industry?
Well, you just need to look at all the support that has gone into the tourism industry, as well as the broad-based support that we've given. And, I'm part of the Cabinet that made those decisions, the $400 million Tourism Recovery Fund, and all the ways that we've used it to support not just the supply of tourism, but also to drive demand. $50 million in the Regional Events Fund, the over $20 million for the RTOs. So, those are the issues that we've been
early on, Calvin?
Say again, Todd?
Did you advocate for travel agents early on, Calvin? They had to wait 6 months to get support from the government.
Well, of course, we have the conversations. Myself and Minister Whaofoe have, the announcement was made around the $50 million, well, just under $50 million that is going to help the travel agents.
So I guess the point is it was only after concerted political pressure and these people waited 6 months that actually the government took it seriously. And I think what the tourism sector needs, because it is in a crisis, there are a lot of businesses that will close, is decisions that are made more quickly. Lisa, you asked Calvin about, the tourism sector's
the middle seat one. Would you change it?
Yeah, I can be really clear on this. If the mask works and it can be shown to be safe, yes, we should do it.
That's a lot of qualifiers and a lot of ifs. So
it's not,
what's your
because
position?
I don't get to sit in the cabinet around the cabinet table and had the advice that Calvin says he gets but won't share around health. But as a tourism minister, I would be advocating for it. It would be for health to say whether or not it's possible. But we've been told if we wear masks around the country, the risk diminishes, and therefore, as we look at what is needed for tourism, the bar for that social distancing on their airplanes, I guess, would have to be extremely high. That would be the case for the health minister to make. As tourism minister, I would be advocating.
So basically, he's saying what I said, but I've got the information. I'm privy to the information.
In the 5 minutes we've got left, I want to look forward here at opportunities. Okay, so. Is this, you talk about pivoting a bit, Calvin, but is this an opportunity to reimagine this industry? And first off, would we look at the number of people we had coming into this country, like about 3.9 million visitors a year? Do we want that? Is it sustainable? Do we change totally how we look at this industry from this point onwards?
It was sustainable, although, and to give credit to the previous government, they were good at destination marketing. They weren't very good at destination management. And so what we had was rundown tourism infrastructure. We had too many people arriving at too few destinations all at the same time. And that's why we introduced our tourism strategy to make sure that we do have dispersal, that New Zealanders' lives are enhanced by tourism, that we increase productivity, that we look after our environment, both the cultural and the natural environment. So, we had a plan that was in place. Unfortunately, COVID came along, but we also responded to COVID.
So, Todd, would you want to go back to those kind of visitor numbers, or almost 4 million a year?
Well, those sorts of visitor numbers are sustainable in New Zealand if we work very hard. I think we can use what's happened now as an opportunity to look more broadly at infrastructure and work closely with councils and other regions about the type of infrastructure they need to come up with a better model to fund this rather than, budget to budget. And we were in government, actually. I don't think we got it all right either. But largely...
You didn't get it all right either, did you say? Then you made some mistakes. Which were they? I don't think we got everything right either in this respect. But, of course, we were coming out of the GFC and visitors started to come and it was creating jobs and that was important at the time. If you just take Queenstown as an example, it is challenging that, before COVID, the people of Queenstown who rely upon tourism for their livelihood also knew that it wasn't, the nice place it used to be to live. So let's look forward here, Todd. You won't tell us a single thing about the policies that you're going to announce this election around tourism, so we don't know what you're doing. Calvin, I want to give you the opportunity. Have you got anything you want to talk about now? Any election announcements for this sector specifically?
Oh, well, look, and I've already said that we're making sure that we keep New Zealand alive in the hearts and minds of our international markets and that we know that we'll need to invest. But I just want to touch on something that Todd said because he spoke about forward planning. We introduced the International Visitor Levy, which he vehemently opposed, which was collecting $80 million a year.
It's just another tax and you haven't spent the
was
money.
Giving us the ability to plan in advance, 5 years in advance, so that we could address the issues that we're facing in the tourism sector. I want to hear them say that they're going to chuck that international visitor levy out.
OK, we're almost out of time, so I'm going to give you each about 25 seconds. Todd, your one big new idea, game changer for tourism. You've got 20 seconds. Go.
Yeah, thank you. So the game changer for tourism, I think, in the coming year is to find ways to incentivise New Zealanders to do more and to spend more. Tourism is a vibrant industry. Up to 400,000 people were employed there. Those people need those jobs, and we need to get Kiwis out doing more and spending in the short term. Longer term, the idea must be to make sure we're an attractive destination. That conversation about how we can safely start to look to open the border is important today. Otherwise, Lisa, far too many tourism businesses that deserve to survive won't get to, and the jobs that we depend upon.
If I had a buzzer, it would go now. So, Calvin, what is your one new big idea, game changer for tourism?
Well, it's basically increasing the productivity of the sector. We had a lot of visitors that came that didn't spend a lot and didn't actually contribute as much to New Zealand as they could have. So it's about attracting the high value visitors to New Zealand and making sure that we can get them to stay here longer and spend more and increase and improve the lives of New Zealanders at the same time.
Thank you very much, and I thank you both for joining me this evening. That was Todd McClay and Calvin Davis.
RNZ News at 6. Ngā mihi nui ko Susana Leatawa tēnei. The Health Minister is warning disinformation is threatening to block the path to Alert Level 1. Chris Hipkins says organised campaigns designed to confuse are undermining the response to COVID-19, and he's urging people to think before sharing unverified information. Mr Hipkins says the government may consider criminal charges for repeat offenders. 4 new cases of COVID-19 have been reported today, 2 of them community cases from a subcluster linked to the Mount Roskill Evangelical Fellowship and 2 in managed isolation. Some people linked to the Mount Roskill Church cluster were initially sceptical about the seriousness of the pandemic, but leaders of the Mount Roskill Evangelical Church are now working with health officials to make sure its congregation get retested for COVID-19. Mr Hipkins says there has been excellent cooperation.
Church leaders are actively encouraging all of their members of the congregation to retest by Friday and to comply with other public health requirements such as self-isolation. As a result of this cooperation, by 8 o'clock this morning, labs had registered new tests for 64% of the congregation.
Chris Hipkins says there are 101 close contacts linked to the subcluster, and officials are calling them daily for symptom checks. The Green Party is playing hardball on tax, floating the prospect of sitting on the crossbenches if Labour does not take a more extreme position. The Labour Party has promised no tax changes other than a new income tax bracket covering only the wealthiest 2%. But the Greens also want a wealth tax hitting those with a net worth more than $1 million. The party's co-leader James Shaw says it's possible the party will walk away from the negotiation table if Labour refuses to budge. Labour is promising to bring forward the goal of 100% renewable electricity to 2030 if elected. The party's leader Jacinda Ardern says Labour will also accelerate the electrification of the transport and industrial sectors, invest in emerging technologies and in a potential dry year storage solution. Ms Ardern says New Zealand has the opportunity to be world leading while meeting its emissions targets.
Very few countries around the world have been able to achieve a goal of 100% renewable electricity. New Zealand has the potential to be one of them. And there's a lot of potential that is unleashed, not just in jobs in the future by achieving that goal, but it is a key part of our branding.
Jacinda Ardern unveiled the party's energy policy in Taupō today. The Electoral Commission says Billy Te Kahika's NZ Public Party has not breached the Electoral Act after it received a complaint about its collection and use of donations. The complaint was referred to the Commission by the Serious Fraud Office, but the agency says the matter will not be taken further. Mr Te Kahika's party has gained a following through sharing conspiracy theories online about COVID-19 and foreign influence. It has formed an alliance with former National MP Jamie Lee Ross's Advance New Zealand Party. The apple industry is calling for a Pacific travel bubble to allow more seasonal workers back into the country in time for the harvest. Despite extending visas for migrant workers stuck in this country and others trapped overseas because of COVID, it's predicted there will still be shortfall of 5,000 to 6,000 pickers this season. Gary Jones from Apples and Pears New Zealand says the shortage could be eased by opening up travel corridors with COVID-free Pacific nations.
And of course, we saw the Cook Islands open up for tourists before lockdown in the last few weeks, and so there's probably precedent for this. And I think New Zealanders have confidence that our Pacific neighbours that have no COVID and can demonstrate that very clearly, it makes sense to open up those corridors.
And Gary Jones says another problem is that there don't seem to be as many unemployed in the regions as predicted. Emergency services are remaining tight-lipped about what caused an explosion at a kāinga ora-owned Invercargill home yesterday. 2 people who were seriously injured remain in a stable condition in Southland Hospital. The police say the fire itself isn't being treated as suspicious, but detectives are investigating the circumstances. The Democratic presidential contender Joe Biden says Donald Trump knowingly and willingly lied to the American people about the threat posed by coronavirus. The accusation follows the publication of excerpts from a new book by the journalist Bob Woodward. The president told him he wanted to play down the risks because he didn't want to create panic. But Joe Biden says Mr. Trump's lack of action caused people to die.
Trump has just stunned everyone around him. It's just how corrupt his thinking is. He says he didn't want to panic people. Well, at least make sure everybody has the equipment they need. Just say this, just excess of caution. He didn't even do that.
Democrat presidential nominee Joe Biden. It's 5 minutes past 6. New Zealand football has taken advantage of the global pandemic to lock in some of their biggest matches in years. The All Whites will play England on November 12th in London, following a match against world number 1 Belgium. All Whites coach Danny Hay wants to get his side some top quality games before the World Cup qualifiers and is pleased the matches against European powerhouses have come about.
It has been a little bit of a benefit because these European nations wouldn't have been forced to play 3 games in each window, but as it stands with UEFA, they're trying to make things very fair, and they're saying that they want to play 3 games, of which 2 are part of the Nations League, and then obviously it leaves one spare for a number of them. So we've taken advantage of that.
Football coach Danny Hay. Former Australian netball international Natalie Medhurst has announced her retirement from the sport. The 36-year-old goal attack recently had a baby and intended returning to the sport, but due to COVID-19 restrictions, she is unable to rejoin her Collingwood side for the Australian domestic competition. And the International Olympic Committee has expressed confidence in its preparations and in Japanese government support for next year's postponed Tokyo Games. The IOC says while matters such as international spectators or qualification need to be finalised months in advance, no deadline has yet been set. That's the news.
Take the pulse of the day's news every weeknight at 10.
So you have 20 to 30 years of American-based evangelical Christian narratives that are often anti-science and anti-government.
Live with local, national and international stories as they happen.
It is the women's artistic gymnastics that seem to have been the cause of
many of the complaints.
Up to date if you're up late. Lately with Karen Hay every weeknight from 10 on RNZ National.
Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. Northland to Waitomo, also Coromandel, Bay of Plenty and Taupo. Cloudy tonight, isolated showers turning to rain for a time. Tomorrow showers in Northland, becoming fine elsewhere, apart from a few showers in the afternoon or evening. For Gisborne and Hawke's Bay, fine weather, then showers from tonight, some heavy tomorrow with hail. Taumaranui and Taihape to Wellington, also Wairarapa and Marlborough. Occasional showers turning to rain for a time tonight, some showers heavy tomorrow with hail possible and snow to 600 metres. Nelson and Buller, rain easing to a few showers, fine tomorrow. Westland and Fiordland, fine apart from occasional showers about southern Fiordland. Canterbury, occasional showers with snow, lowering to 600 metres for a time, easing tomorrow. Otago and Southland, showers clearing tomorrow and becoming fine. Chatham Islands, occasional rain. RNZ National, it's almost 8 minutes past 6.
Thanks, Susanna. This is Checkpoint and I'm Lisa Owen. A dying Australian man is being denied the chance to farewell his 4 young children as Queensland authorities enact a hardline approach to COVID border security. Mark Keynes has terminal cancer and is not expected to live until Christmas. His dying wish is to see his 4 children, aged between 7 and 13, to say goodbye. But the problem is the children live with their mother in Sydney, and Queensland health officials say because borders are closed, only one child can cross the border from New South Wales to say goodbye. Queensland Premier Anastasia Palaszczuk insists it's not her decision, saying instead it's the decision of health authorities. But as State Premier, she does have the final say on who comes across the border and who doesn't. She's already granted an exemption for Hollywood actor Tom Hanks and for AFL players and officials to self-isolate at private hotels. A short time ago, Liberal National Party Shadow Health Minister Ros Bates told our producer Bridget Burke the lack of humanity and compassion shown makes Queenslanders sick.
Queensland Health finally agreed to apparently allow one adult and one child to be picked up at the border and taken to the hospital for 1 hour. And this dad just wants his kids to see their dad before he gets any worse. And this has been going on for a month, and they can't afford the flights or the hotel quarantine. And how you could actually make a decision for which child it is that's allowed to come across the border is just inhumane. I couldn't imagine that if that was a family member of mine, where my 3 sisters and I had to decide which one of us was going to go to our family member's funeral.
Who made the decision?
Well, obviously Anastasia Palaszczuk is the Premier of this state. She is the one where the buck stops with her, and she keeps blaming the Chief Health Officer for all of these incidences, where she, as a Premier, if she had any compassion, she would actually override any decision and make sure that loved ones can be with their family, especially when they've got cancer and they're dying. I mean, that is just inhumane.
What pressure is she coming under in Parliament and in the court of public opinion?
Well, Premier Anastasia Palaszczuk has rolled out the red carpet here in Queensland for Australian rules football players, for officials and their families to all cavort around in a resort in my own electorate, mind you, while everyday Australians who've got critical medical conditions have been ignored or rejected. And it is time for common sense, for consistency and compassion, and not special deals to sporting stars and celebrities. And it seems that under the Palaszczuk Labor government, there is one rule for the rich and another for everyone else.
What would you do to help this family, Ros?
Well, Bridget, I'm a nurse, so my compassion is always worn on my sleeve. I mean, the first thing I would do would be to make sure that these families are together. These families aren't at risk. There are 4 kids who want to be with their father. I mean, for God's sake, it's not that difficult a decision to make. And for Premier Anastasia Palaszczuk, the Labor Premier, to keep buck-passing it to the Chief Health Officer, she could make that decision right now, today, like she could for many other decisions here in Queensland. And Queenslanders are sick to death of Anastasia Palaszczuk blaming everybody else and then having different rules for celebrities like Tom Hanks. I think the thing that sticks in the core of every Queenslander is when Anastasia Palaszczuk said the Queensland hospitals are only for Queenslanders. Now, we are Australians first before we're Queenslanders. So, the family just want to be with him. I mean, they're not going to make him any worse. The man is dying. He just wants to see his kids.
And yet you've got the family and wives of AFL players coming to sit poolside and enjoy their good time there. Is that correct?
Absolutely, and it makes Queenslanders sick to see that 400 AFL officials, I mean, these aren't even the players, these are all the sidekicks and their wives and their kids, who were all at running around in the swimming pool and at the bar at the Mercure Hotel in my own electorate. Yet we've got people here like Mark, we've got other people like young Sarah, a Queenslander today, who hasn't even been allowed to go to her father's funeral. She tried to get an exemption to get here, to be with him before he died. He's since died, and the Premier has not even reneged and allowed her to go to the funeral today at 2 o'clock. She's missed saying goodbye, and her 12-year-old sister had to say goodbye on her own with no support from her big sister. I mean, that is just horrendous.
There does seem to be a lack of continuity in the way the rules and exemptions are applied, which must be galling for those in this position of terminal illness and loved ones and final farewells. It is hideous. Is there any hope, realistically, in your view, Ros, is there any hope of a rethink on this that will favour the families?
Look, the only way that we can get a decision made on this is to shame Anastasia Palaszczuk into it. And the media have done a great job over here in Australia and here in Queensland. People have had enough. They can see the double standards. As I said, Palaszczuk has one rule for the rich and one rule for everyone else. And I can tell you that their priorities of this Labor government are all wrong, and Queenslanders will pass their verdict in 51 days at the next state election.
Ros Bates speaking there. Intimidated, unsafe and scared to be Māori. That's how Māori academics at Waikato University say they're feeling and believe the institution has a serious racism issue. An open letter demanding action has now garnered more than 3,000 signatures, and the university has commissioned an independent review. Te Aniwa Hurihanganui reports.
Professor Po Temara says he and his colleagues are quietly keeping to themselves at the university, treading carefully while an inquiry into claims of casual and structural racism is underway. He says many of them are fearful for speaking out.
The key outcome, of course, that we would want is for the intimidation that we all feel from the management of the university to stop immediately. We are really frightened about being Māori at the university and doing Māori things at the university.
The allegations include Māori expertise being ignored and undervalued, tokenism, lower pay for Māori staff and no meaningful commitment to the Treaty of Waitangi. Professor Rangimā Tāmua has worked at the university for the last 10 years.
I have been made to feel very unsafe, culturally unsafe, and fearful of retribution for having any sort of academic freedom of voice. It's come to a point for me personally where I can't sit idle anymore.
RNZ understands the university will not be renewing the contracts of the Māori and Indigenous Studies Dean, Professor Brendan Hokowhitu, or their world-renowned Indigenous Studies expert, Professor Linda Tuhiwai-Smith. Rangimā Tāmua says that would be unbelievable, and he's now questioning his own place at the university.
I think that is an absolute crime. I think we should be collectively embarrassed that this institution won't employ one of the world's leading Indigenous academics. And that really, for me, made me question whether or not it's even worthwhile maintaining my employment here at this institution.
The university says it cannot comment on individual employment matters. Meanwhile, more than 3,000 people have signed an open letter calling for the University of Waikato to eliminate structural racism and protect those who have raised the issue publicly. Former Waikato University employee, Associate Professor Leonie Pihama, has also thrown her support behind them.
It's incredibly difficult to stand up in any institution when you're Māori, but particularly within a university that has a high level of power, high level of status, where your professional capacity and development is often determined by the people that you're standing up against.
While employed by the university in 2018, Ms Pihama joined a protest with staff and students to fight a proposal by the university to remove the faculty status of Māori and Indigenous studies. She says they were successful, but it doesn't feel like it.
And Māori staff and Māori knowledge in that faculty have been incredibly marginalised in the university, been made invisible in many ways. They no longer have a board of studies, which is integral to being able to operate as a faculty.
In a statement, the university says there is no set time frame for the independent review, but promises the findings will be made public when it's complete. It says Sir Harawira Gardner and former National Party MP Hekia Parata were chosen to lead the review for their extensive experience in the education sector and the Waitangi Tribunal. Ko te aniwa, hurihanga nui aho.
Young people stuck in New Zealand due to travel restrictions are now able to enrol in a school as temporary domestic students until the end of the year. It's likely to affect about 1,300 students, some who may have missed out on months of education while stuck in New Zealand. But the Education Minister, Chris Hipkins, says he isn't sure if the support will be extended past 2020. Katie Doyle reports.
Today's announcement will affect about 1,300 students aged between 5 and 18 who have not been able to get flights home due to COVID-19. They'll attend schools throughout the country, including Glenview School in Porirua East, which is taking on one extra student from the Pacific. Its principal, Lyndon Knight de Blois, says the student has already been attending the school for a few months, but having her officially enrolled is a big relief.
We can count them in our role, which will contribute to our resourcing, hopefully. And I think for schools that are enrolling a few of them, that will make a big difference. So it's a relief now to know that they're officially domestic students for the meantime.
To be enrolled, students have to meet a strict eligibility criteria. They must have arrived before April 2nd, hold a valid visa, and be living with family. Additionally, they cannot have arrived here intending to enrol as an international student or be currently enrolled as one. The Education Minister, Chris Hipkins, says COVID-19 has created a lot of disruption, and he's happy the government is offering additional support.
We've been working as quickly as we can to identify groups that need that extra support. This is a group who we would have expected to have left the country by now. They haven't, they can't, and so we're providing them with that extra level of support.
But whether that support will continue past the end of this year is still up in the air.
A lot will hinge on when does travel start to resume, and bearing in mind that travel may start to resume even before restrictions are eased, but at the moment travel is very, very limited. The number of flights coming in and out is very, very small.
The president of the Auckland Primary Principals Association, Stephen Lethbridge, says being able to enrol students for even one term is great news. He says the students are here through no fault of their own and deserve to continue their education. And Mr Lethbridge thinks the students will be excited to head back into the classroom.
It's clear that children need to be in school. Schools in Auckland are safe places. Children need to be in front of teachers and getting on with their learning.
Mr Lethbridge says there is about 300 million children worldwide whose learning has been affected by COVID-19, and he's happy New Zealand can do its bit to help out. For Checkpoint, Katie Doyle.
It's 6:20 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Fruit and veggie growers say visa extensions for temporary workers provide little to help the looming shortage of workers needed to pick crops come harvest time. The government is allowing temporary work visa holders who have been stuck outside of the country due to COVID back in. As well as that, seasonal workers from the Pacific Islands who have been unable to leave will be allowed to stay and work for another 6 months. But growers say unless more seasonal workers are allowed into the country, there's a danger that crops will not be harvested. Anusha Bradley reports.
There are about 5,000 seasonal workers from the Pacific who came here under the Recognised Seasonal Employer, or RSE scheme, who have been unable to return home because of COVID restrictions. They've also been unable to work because their visas have expired, but now they'll be able to continue working. But the Business Development Manager of Apple and Pears New Zealand, Gary Jones, says there's still not enough of them to pick all the fruit come harvest time, and more RSE workers need to be allowed back into the country.
We have around 5,000 RSEs here at the moment, and that's probably 5,000 or 6,000 less than we might have at a normal peak. So we are short, and there is very real concern about being able to harvest crops as we move into summer fruit, and as a major cab off the rank coming into early summer. There is real concern around that area, and we really want to work with government as quickly as possible to ensure that we can harvest these crops in good time.
Gary Jones says there's an urgent need to create a travel bubble with COVID-free Pacific nations to allow more RSE workers into the country.
We are doing everything we can to identify supply of workers. There has been a view early on through COVID, of course, that there was going to be large numbers of unemployed New Zealanders. I don't think we're really seeing that across our regions, and we've got confidence that the government understands that, but it will require some changes and policy changes and some flexibility to make sure that we do get all this crop off, get that economic value to our regions and all the employment which goes with it.
Some industries, such as kiwi fruit and wine, also rely heavily on the 40,000 backpackers on working holiday visas for the peak harvest season. But fewer than half that number remain in the country. Meanwhile, the dairy industry is welcoming changes that will allow about 40 highly skilled herd managers back into the country. The Chief Executive of Dairy NZ, Tim Mackle, says while his organisation's very happy with this development, there are still many gaps to be filled.
The numbers are not huge in comparison to our overall needs, and we'll certainly be turning our attentions back to the several thousand temporary work visa holders who are on our farms right now, and they've had an extension by the government around 6 months. So some of those will start to expire early next year, and we really need to get into gear and sort that out so that we can keep our farms running.
RNZ understands the Immigration Minister is due to decide shortly on whether to grant an extension to working holiday visa holders who are currently here, allowing them to work in the horticulture or wine industries. A decision is also on the table which could allow RSE workers to carry out their 2 weeks managed isolation in facilities run by their employers rather than in hotels. For Checkpoint, Anusha Bradley.
Let's head to America now, and US President Donald Trump knew COVID-19 was deadlier than the flu before it hit the country, but wanted to play down the crisis, according to a new book. Bob Woodward, the journalist who broke the Watergate scandal, interviewed Mr. Trump 18 times from December to July, with Mr. Trump telling him the virus was deadly stuff before the first US death was confirmed. Gillian Kitchener reports.
It's going to disappear. One day it's like a miracle. It will disappear.
Those optimistic words by President Donald Trump in February were under renewed scrutiny Wednesday after an upcoming book by journalist Bob Woodward revealed the president knew early on how deadly and contagious the novel coronavirus was, but did not convey that information to the American people because he did not want to create a panic. In a recording of a February 7th interview with Woodward, Trump said, quote, "It goes through the air. That's always tougher than the touch. You don't have to touch things, right? But the air, you just breathe the air, and that's how it's passed. And so that's a very tricky one. That's a very delicate one. It's also more deadly than even your strenuous flus." But publicly, Trump played down the threats, just days later telling Americans,
Now the Democrats are politicizing the coronavirus. You know that, right? Coronavirus. And this is their new hoax.
In comments to Woodward in March, Trump explained it was a strategy. Quote, "I wanted to always play it down. I still like playing it down because I don't want to create a panic."
You don't want to see panic.
In that conversation, Trump also told Woodward that some startling facts had just come out about the virus's targets, saying, quote, "It's not just older, young people too, plenty of young people." The recorded interviews obtained by CNN and from reporting by Woodward for his new book, Rage, come as Trump's efforts to battle COVID-19 face intense criticism. The virus has killed more than 190,000 people in the United States so far. Trump on Wednesday defended his comments from earlier this year.
Certainly, I'm not going to drive this country or the world into a frenzy. We want to show confidence. We want to show strength. We want to show strength as a nation. And that's what I've done.
But Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden called the president's actions a betrayal.
He failed to do his job on purpose. It was a life and death betrayal of the American people.
You know, his failure has not only cost lives, it sent our economy in a tailspin. It cost millions more in American livelihoods.
The University of Washington's Health Institute last week forecast that U.S. coronavirus deaths could reach 410,000 by year end.
And that report from Gillian Kitchener. The All Whites will play England for the first time in almost 30 years when they take on the world's fourth-ranked football side at Wembley in London in November. The match will have to be played behind closed doors because of COVID-19 restrictions and will be played a month after the All Whites take on the world's top-ranked side, Belgium, in Brussels in October. All Whites coach Danny Hay told our sports editor Stephen Houston getting to play at Wembley will be surreal.
Incredibly exciting, isn't it? Yeah, we're not taking the easy road, testing ourselves against, number 1 and number 4 in the world. So we've put multiple plans in place and they're changing on a daily basis in terms of the makeup of the squad, who we can assemble in Europe. So it's very challenging. I'm not going to try and hide from that fact, but still there's a real desire to make sure that these games go ahead.
At this point, who do you think you've got available?
I couldn't even give you a 100% guarantee about that because it's like I said, it's changing on a daily, if not hourly basis. One thing that is looking really challenging is trying to get players out of the States or back into the States, and they're in the midst of the MLS season. Players from this part of the world, very difficult as well. So it would have to be primarily European-based. And as I said, there's even challenges inside Europe with some nations putting quarantine restrictions on the players when they come back into their countries.
You would expect, though, to have the likes of Chris Wood available?
Yeah, 100%. So there's the likes of Woodsy will be able to get in and out of England. But like I said, there are other players, other key players that where that's going to be proven to be some sort of challenge.
Do you think these games would have come about without COVID?
Probably not. So we've I guess that is one thing that COVID has been a little bit of a benefit because these European nations wouldn't have been forced to play 3 games in each window, but as it stands with UEFA, they're trying to make things very fair, and they're saying that they want to play 3 games, of which 2 are part of the Nations League, and then obviously it leaves one spare for a number of them. So we've taken advantage of that, and like I said, let's just keep our fingers crossed and hope that they absolutely go ahead.
And that was the all-white coach, Danny Hay, and he was talking to sports editor Stephen Hewson. A few of you getting in touch about our discussion around tourism, and we had Todd McClay and Calvin Davis in the studio for that. This person says so many topics in this tourism interview, so much the sector could and does want and need answers and direction on. Border discussion, cruise, quality and value, service, agents and how they work. It could go on and on. And Jurgen says what will be important to consider is that New Zealand will not open its borders sufficiently to save businesses for at least a year. We need to invest wisely rather than putting money into the hole. Back tomorrow.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. The government is warning it may consider criminal charges for people who continue to deliberately spread lies about COVID-19. Health officials say leaders of Auckland's Mount Roskill Evangelical Fellowship, which is linked to the community outbreak, are now working to make sure its members get retested. National is accusing Labour of not being transparent enough about how millions are being doled out to tourist businesses. But Labour's tourism spokesperson told Checkpoint he has always been clear that not everyone in the industry can be saved. In Taranaki, part of State Highway 3 south of Waitara remains closed after a fatal crash. One person died in the crash on Devon Road near Brixton and another received serious injuries. Those are the headlines. Our next news is at 7.
Tonight on Nights, Rachel Church puts Mahler's 4th Symphony into context.